Welcome everyone to Building a Primer for Biological Data Standards. My name is Abby Benson. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey, and I'm the node manager for the Ocean Biodiversity Information System and the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. I'm also the chair for the ESIP Biological Data Standards Cluster, and I'm joined by my co-chairs, Robert McGuinn, who is here today and will help me with moderating the chat, and Diana Lascala-Grunwald, who will be taking notes and helping us with the Jamboard. And Aaron Satterwhite couldn't be here today. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous lands of the Cheyenne that I am currently speaking to you from and highlight the Indigenous knowledge and understanding of biological and ecological systems that is vital to our understanding today. Please note that by participating in this session, you agree to adhere to the ESIP community participation guidelines, and any issues can be reported at the link in the agenda. Also, this session is being recorded for future viewing. Please stay muted if you are not speaking, and you can post your questions in the chat, or there will be time at the end for discussion if you want to bring your questions and speak them live. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand using the raise your hand feature under the reactions options. We would appreciate it if you could record your name, affiliation, your location, your domain of knowledge. So here we're kind of looking for whether you're marine, terrestrial, aquatic, or maybe all three, because we're trying to get more participation in the cluster from terrestrial and aquatic folks. And your level of experience with data management in the notes document. This is to help us with understanding who's here today with us. The goals for our session are to get more terrestrial aquatic folks involved in the cluster, get feedback from the broader ESIP community on the primer, build awareness about the cluster and the primer, and determine a pathway to a final product for this primer. So now we'll start off with a presentation about the cluster and an introduction to the primer. So let me... Oh, right. Wait, that's not where we want to be. All right. Does it look okay? Diana, can you give me a thumbs up? Thanks. So the ESIP Biological Data Standards Cluster and Primer. I'm the lead of the cluster, and I went through my co-leads, but I couldn't do this work without them. So I'm so grateful to have their help with this cluster. The way that this cluster kind of got started is there was an IUCE ESIP Biological Data Standards workshop last summer. It was intended to be in person, and of course it was virtual. We brought together 90 participants to discuss biological data standards. And this workshop really started because some of the, me and OBIS USA, some of the folks in IUCE and at BICO-DUMO, we were curious what standards people were using across the different repositories and data aggregators. And there was a sense that we didn't really know what people were using as far as standards for biological data. So this workshop was intended to bring people together to kind of raise awareness about the standards and get a sense of what people are doing as far as using standards for biological data. And we had several themes. I'm not going to read through all of them, but the one that I'd like to point to is building a community of practice was one of the themes, and kind of is where we're focused on today. So the problem, as identified by one of the workshop attendees, is that the diversity of biological data and seeming lack of overarching community standards makes working with biological data challenging. So there are several standards out there for biological data, but not everyone knows about them, or maybe it's sometimes difficult to apply them. And so the biological data community in the US could benefit from guidance, best practice documentation, training, and community building. So that's where this cluster kind of got its start, and it came after the workshop. It started in September of last year, and the goal of the ESIP Biological Data Standards Cluster is to maximize data relevance and utility for understanding changes in biodiversity over time. If this sounds of interest to you, if that goal sounds of interest, we have monthly meetings on the first Thursday of the month at 1400 Eastern. So our next meeting is August 5th, if you want to join us. There's a channel in the ESIP Slack. We have our wiki where we post our meeting notes, and there is a mailing list that you can join through ESIP. It can be helpful to understand where this cluster fits in some of the other clusters and working groups that are happening. So the ESIP Biological Data Standards Cluster is intended for any biological data. Right now, it has a little bit of a marine bent to it because of the workshop, and the folks that got started in the cluster kind of came from that workshop, which had a marine focus, but really is intended to be terrestrial, aquatic, any sort of domain of biological data, any type of biological data. Also has a bit of a biological observation data focus right now because I'm leading it, but it's really intended for any standards for biological data. There is a standardizing marine biological data working group that I lead, and that one is specifically with helping people use Darwin Core for their marine biological data, and sharing data to OBIS and GBIF. And then there is an ESIP marine data cluster, which I think we have a couple of the leads from that on the call here today. And that is any marine data. So not just biological data, but any sort of marine data. Going back to the workshop, one of the helpful things that came out of the workshop is we identified several low-hanging fruit or action items that the cluster could take. So the first meeting of the cluster, we had a list and we had a Slido poll. So we selected the ones that we thought would be best for the cluster to address. The highest rated one was to create a best practice document for required, recommended, optional information for different standards. The second highest rated one was to create a decision tree for standards related to biological data. The co-chairs and I felt like creating a decision tree was a little bit easier to tackle, so we wanted to start there. And as we went along, we realized the decision tree was going to turn into a decision forest. So it kind of became more of the primer, but just to give you a sense of where we were starting from and why we decided to start working on this primer. The first meeting of the cluster, we asked the participants to tell us, this cluster will be successful if it, and some of the responses included increasing awareness and adoption of biological data standards, enhancing widespread interest in standards, providing clear guidance to someone who's not in the cluster, and kind of becoming a clearinghouse for biological data standards. So with those things in mind and the results from the Slido poll, we decided to start working on a primer for our data managers. And so the aim of this primer is to assist data managers who are unfamiliar with biological data standards with understanding what's out there. Just trying to raise awareness, let more people know who may not know about the different standards that are available to them. And the audience for this is specifically data managers who are tasked with managing biological data. We thought it would be helpful to review some of the decisions from the process that we've gone through. So when we first started with the decision tree, data type was one place where people really wanted to start. We decided that we wanted to go a bit broader than that with this. And I also think since we were starting with a decision tree, data type made sense in that instance. But since we've kind of changed to more of a primer, kind of an overview, the data type, we decided to sort of set that aside for now. It would really, we're hoping it's for any data type of biological data. And so you can help us with letting us know if you agree with that. The audience is specifically for data managers. We did talk a bit about PIs or different sort of communities that we might reach with this primer, but we really wanted to be specific with the audience that it's data managers who are tasked with managing biological data. So do keep that in mind when you're reviewing the primer. It's observation specifically. So a species at a location with a date, and that can come from any methodology. So that could be from an ROV, it could be from plots, from any type of way you might observe species, but it's going to be the tabular information that comes off of that sort of observing methodology. Standardizing doesn't require sharing. So that was a really interesting outcome, that we want to encourage people to use these standards whether or not they're sharing the data, because it's going to be helpful for them in the future. And right now the primer has a marine focus. So how do we expand that? It's just kind of the result of who's involved in the cluster right now and our expertise. So if you have an expertise in some of in terrestrial or aquatic arenas, we'd really love to hear from you about what we're missing. So now I'm going to do a walkthrough of the primer. Okay, Diana, can you still see? Can you see it? Okay. So one thing to note, don't open this with Google Docs, because if you open it with Google Docs, it's going to lose all its formatting and it looks terrible. So don't do that. Just leave it as a PDF like this when you're looking at it, or you can download it if that's easier for you. So this is the primer. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can kind of get a sense of what it looks like. And so I'm going to walk through it a little bit just to give you a sense. We start off at the top with kind of a little bit of information for someone looking at this primer. We have our value proposition here that using standards for your biological observation data means we can understand patterns at scales greater than one project, research group, or organization. So that's one of the places you might focus in on to review. On the left are questions that we think a data manager might ask. So do you want to provide context and understandability to your data? Underneath that is a reason why you might want to do that. So ensures your data are reusable so that yourself and others understand how the data were collected and who to contact for more information. And then on the right-hand side are the standards that you would use to do that, and places that are accepting those standards. And then it moves down with different questions going along with answers on the right-hand side. And so the places we might need help are, the places accepting data using these standards. You might have some contributions there or some input, and or standards that we're missing that we should add to this. Realizing that at one point we were starting to build a spreadsheet with all the different data standards and everything that's out there. And one thing we did realize is we were getting really close to rebuilding fairsharing.org, which was not something we want to do. It already exists. So we kind of want to keep this, not every standard that exists, but just kind of a primer on ones that are out there and places accepting those. So questions going all the way down. And then at the bottom, we have, a letting people know that you can mix and match these standards in any way you see fit, but that certain repositories require certain sets of standards. And then one other thing is that I lost my train of thought. So yeah, this is basically it. This is the primer, and I am going to stop sharing. Well, actually, I'm going to go over to the agenda, and maybe we will take some questions, but I want to give you all a sense of where we're going from here now that we've done the primer. So we've done the presentation and introduced you to the primer. We're going to go into breakout groups. And you're going to review the Canva. The link is here in the notes document. And we want each breakout group to come to decide on one thing they liked, one thing they found confusing, one thing they thought could be improved. And as you develop that feedback, we want you to consider, do the questions on the left make sense? Are the details on the right good comprehensive examples? And is our argument for the importance of data standardization compelling? So let me do a walkthrough of the Jamboard, but maybe I'll take just a second for any questions that have come up. Okay. Robert, were there any questions in the chat that I might have missed?
No questions in the chat yet.
Awesome. Okay, thanks. So let's see the Jamboard. And oh, one thing about the Jamboard, how many folks? We have 29. The Jamboard might get a little laggy if we all sign into the Jamboard. So I was thinking if you might designate one person to be the one to add the sticky notes and things to the Jamboard, that might make it so it's not too laggy for everyone. But we're not too many people, so we should be okay. But let me introduce you all to the Jamboard in case you haven't used one before. So this is Jamboard, and when you are going through, there's one slide for each question, basically. So one thing you liked, the next slide, and you move back and forth up here, is one thing you found confusing. And then the next one is one thing you think could be improved. And then there's a fourth slide where when we come back together, we're going to discuss solutions or resolutions to the previous slides. And Diana is going to help us with keeping these slides kind of organized and helping us come together on some things that are coming to the top. And the way that you add your input is to say, you add a sticky note, and you can change the color of your sticky note here and then save it. And if you are in there and you see that someone else has put up a sticky note and you really agree with it, you want to give it a +1, you can add a shape. And so I like to pick the arrow shape, and you can kind of do this to it to say, yeah, we want to agree with that that was said. And then up here are the things we want you to keep in mind as you're going along. And you can add text boxes if you have something else to say. So that's another way to add things to the Jamboard. Okay, I think that's it. Are there any questions? Before we head out into breakout groups. So we're going to randomly assign you to breakout groups. And if you could go along and post one sticky note from your breakout group to each slide that in the Jamboard, that would be what we're looking for.
Hey everybody, this is Robert. I just posted the Jamboard link in the chat, so if you can go there if you need.
Thanks. Yes.
And 15 minutes, Abby?
15 minutes.
All right.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for diving into that. I think where we're going to go from here is, Diana, do you mind talking about a few of the things that were And well, first, I want to make sure you all had enough time to come to decisions. I guess if there's any group that felt like they didn't have enough time, can you give us a signal of some kind?
Could I just speak really quick?
Yeah, please do.
Hi, I'm Sean Tippett, by the way. We've corresponded once, but yeah, I guess maybe we were just too slow in group 4, but yeah, maybe we didn't get to all the questions. We kind of meandered around some of the first ones, and yeah, so.
Okay, so
worthwhile.
your group could maybe use more time.
Maybe in the future, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes or something like that might be a bit better.
Okay, good to know. Okay,
Mhm.
thanks. All right, well, we'll go with what we have for now, and then if we need to go back out to breakout groups again, we can do that again. So yeah, Diana, are you ready?
Yeah, I will do the best I can. A bunch of new sticky notes appeared right at the end. So I'll be summarizing a little on the fly, but that's okay. If I'm trying to say something about your sticky note and I'm saying it wrong, please feel free to jump in or post comments in the chat. So on the things that people liked, a big black box appeared on the Jamboard halfway through, which blotted out some of the previous comments, but a lot of the comments were around the presentation. People generally liked, you know, the colors and the sort of stylishness of the infographic. And people liked kind of the straightforwardness of the questions and the answers. So thanks for some positive feedback. That's fantastic. So there are a couple of things that I think might be worth, you know, points of confusion that it might be worth having short discussions around as a larger group. One is, it sounds like there's still some confusion about the audience. So maybe we do want to revisit that with the larger group. There's also a question about what's the difference between interoperability and integrating with other data. And, you know, maybe we can discuss the nuance of that and figure out if we can make it more clear in the primer. And then there's a whole bunch of comments about acronyms, which is great. So maybe we can pull the group together and talk about best ways to solve that problem, which is, you know, something we talked about as a cluster as well. And there's a bunch of new stuff on the things that could be improved board. There's a comment about adding use cases. So maybe that would be a discussion around kind of the bottom part of the Canva, and, you know, where we're showing the flow of, you know, where certain data, which standards certain data might use. Yeah, and then there's a couple comments about CMECS and how it might link to other parts. So do we want to, I think it would be reasonable to start by maybe setting a timer and addressing those 2 points of confusion as a group. Does that seem reasonable? So I've set up on the solutions or resolutions to previous slides. So this is slide 4 on the Jamboard. I think 2 things that needed to be clarified were the audience and the interoperability versus integrate with other data. So maybe we can spend, you know, 10 minutes talking about that as a group, and I will bullet out the things that we should solve on the Jamboard while we do that.
Sounds great. Thanks, Diana. So things to clarify the audience. I mean, I popped into breakout room 1 and definitely that was the question there. So maybe this was a question across all the breakout groups. So the audience, this is a data manager who has a data set in their possession. They didn't collect the data, probably, but they're tasked with managing this biological data set. It's in a very project-focused format. It doesn't really have any identifiers. It's not really, you know, it's really just how the project group collected it, and they're tasked with managing this data. So they might have questions, these are questions that they could ask themselves about that data set. How do I want to make sure that this data is reusable, is fair? And so that's kind of, and the repositories are just there to give a data manager an indication of where the data could go if they wanted it to. But as you state on the primer, that you should use standards whether or not you're going to share your data beyond your project or work group, because it's going to help you with your data in the future too. So, but it's usually either like a new data manager who's tasked with managing biological data sets and doesn't know anything about the standards that are out there that could be applied to them, or data managers who are familiar with managing data, but are new to biological data. And I'm thinking of one of Stacy's examples with the NASA group that, bringing in biological data is new for them, but they're used to managing remote sensing data. Stacy might have to help me with that. So are there more questions or more discussion around that? Or does that clear it up some?
I think the question might be how do you then communicate that onto the primer itself? Because
Sure.
It does clear things up, but it's how do you make that short and pithy so that it doesn't end up taking up the whole thing?
Right.
I mean, maybe it's a question like your other questions, like, are you a new to working with biological data? This primer might be for you or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's good feedback.
Yeah, just reword perhaps like in that top section, right, under biological observation data standardization, like under that title, the primer, and then something like this. Seems like that would be a good place to put it right there.
Yeah. Right, so maybe we modify a primer for data managers, try to make that a little bit longer or more informative.
Or maybe it could be like the part where you start out with using standards for your biological observation data, and then, I mean, that's good language after following that too, but I don't know, if there's some way to put that succinctly right there, or perhaps have one more line, or I don't know, sorry.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah.
Adding on, so like a primer for data managers, where data managers is just kind of generic, but maybe you make that a bit more specific, like a primer for data managers of, and this will be redundant, but like a well, I don't know.
I appreciate where Madison is going with this, because I found it hard to identify the audience myself. And so I think that I'm confused as to whether these folks that you're describing would be sitting on an infrastructure that would allow them to realize all of the content here. So it seems like it's a very specific person. Like, would they be enacting and enabling web standards, or standing up an ERDAP server, or would they be going to a repository that already has that capability? I guess that's where I'm having a hard time trying to tease apart this specific person versus somebody who's already associated with an existing repository that undergoes all of this by default. So this person might need a little more describing.
Sure.
And that specific row also came up in our group, the share your data on the web. Somebody mentioned that the audience that they were thinking of wouldn't necessarily have control over any of those things.
Right, agreed.
Okay.
I'll agree with that too. I'm not sure that necessarily falls under your typical data management role, right?
And also, if the audience is new data managers or new people to biological data management, it kind of goes back to one of the points, do we need to define the acronyms? Will they automatically know that EML is ecological markup language? There is a lot of terminology on the page that assumes a familiarity with the biological community.
Yeah, very true. We have discussed, having a backside to this, that's things that's written out, like things that are actually like paragraphs of information, but we wanted this to be a quick, yes, I want to make my data interoperable. Okay, maybe I go look at NERC or ENVO to try to help me with doing that. But that's,
I
yes,
completely
it
agree.
is very acronym heavy for sure.
The acronyms make it readable, but it might need that sort of supporting documentation to truly make it effective.
Yeah, agreed.
Well,
Okay,
can you provide
Yeah.
links?
yeah.
So maybe,
Go ahead, Dinah.
sorry, I was just gonna say, so maybe this is a great time to transition into the acronym question, which a bunch of different people brought up. And yeah, we recognize that acronyms in this space is a huge problem. We would love to know what people think about how we can actually solve that. Do we need an additional resource? We talked about having a backside that like defined the acronyms. We could add some links. So yeah, anybody who has thoughts about how to solve that or help with that, that would be great.
Can I just say something to fill some air? I'm sure it's not adding anything. But if you're really a novice and looking at this, how would someone react to all these acronyms in the first place? Like NASA is probably well enough understood, but DAAC small s, what the heck is a DAAC small s? And NCEI, it's not totally recognizable. GBIF, OBIS, IUS, I don't think those are recognizable. And those are more marine focused. So that was another issue. So what if you're coming from, I'm sorry, the OBIS and IUS are marine focused. So what if you're coming from a terrestrial bent? Why are we putting marine focused stuff on this level of document? So I
If you
think,
have suggestions of terrestrial resources that we could include, that would be really great. We would love to expand.
but one thing we do with our public affairs documents in our organization is we use plain language instead of our jargon or speak. So maybe just wipe out all the acronyms. That would be the solution. It's get everything that's not recognizable to your audience out of this document, but refer to other documents that have the technical detail.
I was kind of thinking, I mean, it seemed to me looking at the primer that you guys are, and this is my first time looking at it, so I'm totally new to it. So like, I like the plain language on the left-hand side of the questions, but then, it seems to me that on the right-hand side, it kind of is appropriate to have to list all of those different standards and organizations, because that's the point, right? It's like you're pointing people to say like, okay, if this is what you're trying to do, here, go look up what an ISO standard is. Anybody can Google a DAC, and I would hope that, that's what I did the first time I heard that word or that acronym, like in a meeting, I think it's good to have just kind of like this whole list of things that people, you're just pointing people in the right direction, right? You're not trying to necessarily take them all the way to like where they need to be, but like point them in that right direction. So that kind of makes sense to me, but that's how it appeared to me looking at it the first time this morning.
And one of the thoughts in our group was to add in hyperlinks to all of these resources. So that might help clarify, this is what we're talking about when we talk about ISO 19115 or EML.
Yeah, I think hyperlinks are a good idea, but for some formats, and then I don't know, you have to worry about making things 508 compliant, and so that might not really work for that. But then to have like the backside with a list of all the URLs or something kind of seems like a good workaround, to have it be like a two-sided one-pager or a two-pager, whatever you call it. But
I'm still trying to read through it as well. So with the first one, it almost, as I read it, seems like two things. So it's where do I want to send my data, which could be science-based or NASA DAC or data.gov, but there are metadata standards that are within those archives, but there also may be metadata standards associated with the individual archive. So it's what standards are you trying to apply, and where should I send my data? If you have, there could be archive specific, like genomic data goes to some specific place versus some, or if you have a project, they may tell you where exactly to send it. So there's an initial question as to where is it going?
Well, so we are not trying to adjust where it's going, because we think you should apply standards even if it's not going anywhere, even if it's just sitting on your server and it's never being shared to anyone else. You should still apply standards. So that's why this is coming at it from a point of view of, these are standards that can help me with my data, even if I don't share it. So yeah, Danny, looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I would say that maybe the bottom light blue bar just before the links, the required standards for certain repositories, there are only a few there. And just as I don't know who the last speaker was, I didn't catch the name, I apologize, but you might want to consider, or maybe consider modifying just the list there, because it seems like that reading that seems to imply that either it's an absolute list or that I'm shooting for a particular standard to use a particular repository. And so if that's not the intent, then maybe it's even just the title there. For example, I think Data One can accept, multiple, even though they have a core standard. Same Bicudemo is the same way. We have no standard to accept data, but we write it out in a number of formats, right? And so we crosswalk among a lot, and maybe even including that some repositories have a capability of mapping across standards, or
Sure, yeah.
Maybe
sense.
the intent, clarifying the intent of that little box. But I did want to say one other thing, Abby, that I love the bar right above it, is your data software ready? I think that's a great box that leads to interoperability, certainly, and integration, right? And I think that section is so big, I would almost want to put it at the top if it were me. And I feel like all the tips are even great to push down to the PI level. Like PIs can grasp a lot of that content, like, hey, use vocabularies for taxa, or put your date in a date format that everybody uses in addition to software, or make sure your latitude and longitudes are in a community accepted format, or whatever those little bits are. I feel like that's great, and takes the data observations themselves, closer to the goal line for interoperability. I think that was a great addition.
So thanks, Danny.
And in our group, to jump off of that, we were talking about how on the right, it seems like we almost need more actionable advice on the right column as opposed to just a list of standards. And I think pulling from, like, thinking about what is in that make your data software ready, that one, where it is a little bit more actionable, like use non-proprietary formats, that might be helpful to kind of include that type of language throughout all of the sections on the right.
Yeah, this is Sky, and yeah, just to add to that just a little bit, I think that that would overall make the whole thing kind of tremendously powerful in a lot of ways, because it would, if you can say on the left, here's a key principle you need to ascribe to, and then on the right, maybe try to focus on what is the biggest thing that you can do for that particular principle. What's kind of like one of the main things in that area that if you did this, if everybody did this, we'd end up with a lot more interoperable and usable data. And then include in that right-hand side, okay, now here's where you need to go for further information on how to dig into this particular principle a little bit deeper, including those references and other things that we've talked about getting pointed to. So I think if that element of that really actionable key thing could be added there, I think it would really drive home the point for what people actually have to do if they're going to take action on this.
I hear that and I understand it, but I think, you know, what we're trying to build is a primer for the standards, not necessarily a primer for the reasons or the actionable, you know, the actions to take necessarily. We're trying to build awareness about the standards that exist because not everyone knows about them. And that's really kind of the key thing for this primer.
Yeah, so it seems like we've kind of transitioned into another theme that a lot of people brought up, which is that there needs to be more links or more resources or more potentially use cases. So does anybody want to expand further about how we might include, I don't think we've really touched on use cases yet, or other resources, or maybe a follow-up product related to this that would help?
Well, this is Danny. I was leaning toward the use cases, or I was an advocate for use cases to help identify or more clarify the intended audience. So that's where that was coming from. Like, I am a data manager sitting on a data set and I want X, is, you know, this is my driver. And so that's was my intent. I'm sure there were others in the group that also, you know, had thoughts on use cases as well.
I have more to add on that previous discussion. I hear, Abby, what you're interested in, and more like a guide for standards. But what you're presenting here into the audience, where they're not ready to kind of just jump to the acronym or to this ISO 19115, people make fun of that all the time because it's such a random number and people spit it out like it's secondhand knowledge. Maybe in just that first box, you could have use geospatial metadata standards, use ecological metadata standards. And I'm sure there are other things you can do to make data understandable. So metadata is not the only thing. And maybe that could actually improve what, you know, the key take homes people have for each of these.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. The other things that we haven't had a chance to touch on yet was kind of the nuance between interoperability versus integrate with other data. Do we want to explore that a little bit?
Sure, I can try to tackle that a little bit. So, you know, we're trying to point people at different standards and what they do. And so standards like Darwin Core allow you to integrate the data together, but it doesn't necessarily apply any controlled vocabularies to the data. And so interoperability comes when you use a controlled vocabulary to actually be very specific about what different values mean or different terms mean in the data. And so that's sort of the difference we're trying to go for there between integrate and interoperability. I mean, just because you can put several data sets together into one Uber data set doesn't mean that it's interoperable necessarily. Does that help? Go ahead, Stace.
Hi, it's Stace from Woods Hole Oceanographic, and I was in room 2, and we noticed something with regard to the integrate your data section that we think is missing in this primer. And it's with regard to integrating the biological data with other data from the same samples. And it's basically the concept of sample identification. And I realized that, well, maybe there isn't a standard for sample identification, but there is an international sample identifier number used in the geological sciences. And that might be something we want to include in this recommendation. And we did have someone in our group who is working with soil samples, so that is pretty relevant, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point, Stace. And there's work happening in the Darwin Core arena around extended measurement. It's not extended measurement, in fact, it's for samples.
Extended digital object.
Yes.
Yeah, so in the group, I mentioned that line in the primer, data standard Darwin Core. I mean, I know that Darwin Core can accommodate that concept of sample identification, right? And subsampling parent and child. But that's only because I have extensive knowledge of Darwin Core, right? So how I can't think yet how to bring someone in, right? So someone out there has some biological data, it comes from soil samples, they want to be able to express that. At the moment, there's no way to look at this primer quickly and see that relationship.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think, this is just, I think in some ways we're kind of limited by the space. It's just one page of information. It's obviously not going to cover everything or be everything to everyone. So, but it's good. That's a good point. Maybe that's something we could add into the text that we might put on the backside of it, or like a little. Maybe we could have a write-up that goes along with it that could talk about that.
Stace, to your point, couldn't you recommend to use the JSON link data to associate those things? Not that I'm suggesting to create a new standard for biological data, but isn't there a standard for JSON link data?
Yes, some data systems do use JSON LD, for example, but to use that, essentially you supply that with terms, right, from controlled vocabularies and such. So it's, again, it's expressing the relationships that you want to get across to the provider and the user. So that would be an Adam Shepard question. I know Danny's in the room, but I just know that it's more than just using JSON LD, it's using the right vocabularies with that.
Hey, this is Robert. I just wanted to mention the chat. We have a couple of comments. One is from Matt Biddle that is talking about, would a new data manager be expected to have experience with XML tools and writing EML or ISO? That's one question. And then another question, there's some talk around the IGSN number that Stace mentioned, is working to merge with DataCite to begin offering IGSNs to a broader audience.
Awesome, thanks, Robert. Yeah, to Matt's question, no, I don't expect a new data manager would be able to create XML right off the bat. They would probably need help. I mean, probably a new data manager, who's interested in applying any of these standards is going to need help from somewhere to actually apply them. This is really just information to let them know that they exist and to do like, I think maybe it was Kate was saying, I'm sorry if I forgot, but that you're going to go and you're going to Google these things and learn more about them that way. So.
Yeah, I would like to add something here. during the original problem statement for the primer, I think what we realized is, there's 100 workflows available to the new data manager. And there's some that are very, very common and some that might be more minority pathways. And I think on this primer, one of the key ideas is to just show people these are the major pathways. And I think, laying out those acronyms will go a long way to helping people. But when you're a new biological data manager, just hearing the acronym and then knowing that you need to know about that is also helpful. And knowing that this group has kind of come together as a consensus that, yeah, this is a major pathway that you need to know about as a new data manager managing biological occurrences. And yes, there might be more minor pathways that we could highlight later, or other pathways that we could highlight, but we wanted to get the major ones on this primer.
Awesome. Diana, was there anything else from the Jamboard that we needed to cover?
Yeah, I think there's one more thing we haven't really touched on, and I think we have, still about 20 minutes, so I think we could chat about it a little bit. There were a couple groups that wanted to talk about links to CMECS.
CMEX, yeah.
CMEX, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Yes. Does anyone who put that on want to talk about that a bit?
I'm happy to talk about it. We did have a couple people from room 2 though, so please feel free to join in if you'd like. The way that we had 2 representatives in the room who were working with this classification system for coastal and marine. I'm probably going to get the acronym wrong, by the way. Coastal and marine, I believe it's ecological classification system, but I'm not sure.
Yep, that's right. Sorry.
Oh, awesome. Great. As a person who has used that classification system to describe habitat, I knew that I could link the CMEX as a controlled vocabulary to the Darwin Core standard under the term habitat, right? So I have this knowledge, I know how to do it, right? But we had 2 new people who are using CMEX and they didn't see it, like they didn't see the pathway to how was that fitting in. So it was fitting in between the interoperable and the integrate with other data. But it's an example of, it was an entry that it didn't seem to have a landing point, right? Like, again, I don't know, that's why we're having this meeting, is because we're coming in from different angles and seeing where the entry points are.
Hi, this is Kate, and I'm with NCEI, and I'm work with CMEX and the originators of the standard, and that, but it is the Coastal and Marine Ecological Classification Standard, and so I'm totally new to this group, and I guess I wasn't really, the way that I think about it, it seems like, oh, okay, well, if you're looking, for if your goal is to do this primer and point people to resources for things like this, CMEX can definitely be viewed as a standard vocabulary and a standard for ecological classification and mapping. And so to see kind of where it fits into this, and so maybe in a couple of different places, but perhaps it just needs to be worded or just thought about like where it fits. Or if you, I don't know, maybe you guys don't kind of want to like highlight vocabularies or something at that level and keep it more general, but yeah.
I mean, I think that's an important one to include. Thanks for bringing it to the table.
Okay.
Kate, yeah, because I think I see it in the controlled vocabularies that make your data interoperable section. It maybe doesn't fit under a control. It might be a controlled. No, it's probably not a controlled vocabulary, but I think of it as being similar to like a taxonomic authority. But maybe it just means we need to add one more sort of set. And we could include terrestrially. I know that there's the classification system for terrestrial habitats that we could put there as well. So that would be good to add in a terrestrial.
Yeah, so exactly. So like Stace says, what you just said, it is for habitat. So, and not specifically, you know, it's not, it doesn't get really down to taxonomic levels, except for, you know, certain situations. So I don't know if it's a bit more of a tangent than what you guys want to get into, but.
I think that's a good, that would be a good addition for sure.
Hey, this is
And then-
Robert.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add on to what Kate was saying there. You know, we often have observations that come in with also a habitat observation. So we have biological observation, but then there's a habitat observation along with it. Sometimes it's not a controlled standard. Maybe it's a regional standard of some sort. And more, it seems like people do want to move to something like CMEX. So I definitely think it's coupled well enough with biological observations that it might deserve a place on this primer. Or not necessarily CMEX, but just the idea of habitat vocabularies and standards as well. But maybe it would broaden out too much the standards. So
Yeah, I think this is a great thing to be talking about. I don't know if this question is off base, but does anybody understand if there's a link between CMEX and habitat classifications and the mixes terms that also kind of do habitat classifications, like N broad scale and N local scale? Does anyone know if there's a connection there?
Can you repeat that? When you said mixes, you mean like combined classes or mixed classes of community? Or is that a specific, that's a name for another?
It's another, it's a standard used by the like molecular biology community.
Okay. Yeah, I
So I think that might be, maybe that's too detailed for this group, but maybe that's a conversation we could have.
Yeah.
I think Danny posted something in the chat and had something on this.
Something to
I
look
think
at.
they have, yeah, MixS does have environmental classifications in it. We're kind of in the throes of teasing that apart now for our own application ontology. I think CMEX, obviously in the marine environment, goes way more detailed than the environmental of MixS. But there are a lot of components, there are a lot of individual terms that seem like they could be mapped easily, but I think CMEX is much more comprehensive for marine stuff. But I agree with the way the conversation was going, that CMEX is, I don't know if it's, maybe Kate can comment on how much it's getting used outside of NOAA. I was advocating for it because it seems like it's withstood the test of time and really, been beefed up over the last several years. So I think it's a great one to add here, but it is marine specific, obviously.
I'd say it is really widely used, and we don't really, have tabs on anything, but we know that, it's got like agency kind of buy-in from, not just NOAA and NIMS, but, agencies like BOEM doing essential fish habitat and NEPA evaluations and things like that. And also the Park Service uses it extensively, but then again, that's habitat for the most part, and it does get to the level of like a community as far as, biology goes, but like I said, doesn't really call out specific taxonomic things. So it would be something that would be used more, I guess, in concert, with a biological classification.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's a good addition. And there's the standard, the other standard I was thinking of as being sort of similar is the National Vegetation Classification System for terrestrial ecosystems. So I think getting those added in there, I think that definitely makes sense. Thanks for bringing that.
Yeah, and so the NVC and CMEX are meant to be complementary and sort of like intersect and be used. If you're going from marine to terrestrial, it should be, we try to align our classes there to be similar. Awesome. And the National Wetlands Classification Standard too. So.
Okay, there's the third we need. Awesome. We got it covered. All the domains. Wow, I think that's first.
Hey, Abby, I would like to call attention to Madison Langseth. She has some comments in the chat. I don't know, Madison, if you'd like to go over your interoperable and the integrated comments there.
Oh yeah, just going back to the conversation or the question that Diana posed from the from our breakouts, but possibly just defining, like instead of using the same word again underneath the question when you're kind of explaining, just defining what those things mean for folks. So I think I said something like, you know, instead of using interoperable again, say ensures your data can be used and understood in the context of another data set, or for integrate, ensures your data can be combined with other data sets. So it kind of provides just a little bit more context for folks where they're trying to figure out what the difference is.
Good point. Thanks, Madison. Sorry, I'm just trying to save those for later. Okay, so I think we've hit all the topics. I'm wondering if we can define some best solutions. Dana, do you feel like we already have those, or should we try to?
I think we definitely have a lot of great suggestions. Some of these comments are kind of more global comments that we just need to think about. I feel like we could possibly come up with a best solution for the acronym question. So some suggestions were to get rid of all the acronyms, to add in links for all the acronyms, to define the acronyms on the back of the primer, English, there we go. I'm looking to see if I saw anything else. Yeah, so I feel like those are three suggestions. I don't know if people have preferences among those three or thoughts about what we like, which one we should zero in on.
There was another suggestion from our group.
Okay.
Primer, and this will go morph back to like the decision tree. If the link could be to like a bookmark on a different page. So not just the definition for the acronym, but actually going into some detail on the guidance. Maybe that's a similarly styled page, but with more info. I'd like also to hear about this cluster's activities and what the plan is moving forward. That could be a potential direction where each page would, you know, take several months to create. So this time next year, you might have a more fully, more comprehensive primer.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And that's actually something we had discussed as a cluster as a potential thing to explore. So it would be great to know if that sounds like it would be useful or a good next step to people.
Hey, this is Robert. Just bouncing off of what Jonathan was saying. The breakout group that I was kind of observing had a note that said, make the ideas on the right more actionable, explain how in addition to what. And so, you know, maybe that could be where we link to has more depth, but then that's sort of saying you're going to create a website. So I'm not sure, but maybe it's links to existing resources out there in the community that say how. Probably that's probably the way to go.
Great. Well, I think if we covered everyone's confusion and things to be improved, then I think we have what we need from this. Diana?
Yeah, I think, you know, to wrap up, we could, yeah, talk a little bit about next steps, and Jonathan got us going in that general direction, but also, you know, maybe folks would like to weigh in the last couple of minutes here on how they would like to receive this or how they see this being presented. So is it digital? Is it print? Is it something you have on the wall next to your desk? Yeah, how do you guys imagine this might be effectively distributed or useful to people?
I think a lot of people commented on how like just actually like lovely it is. Like it looks really nice. I mean, I think this would be a nice handout at something like even the data help desk like the ESIP does. If you would, you know, put a stack of them on that, you know, I'm sure Megan would be amenable to that. Something like that. I think this is a nice, really nice handout along the lines of like, yeah, it's just like you should know about all these things, right? I think that would be a good use for it.
Thanks, Carolina. That's in my mind. I'm going to take a stack of these to ESA and to Ocean Sciences and set them out and hope people look at them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that you can come up with something that works both digitally and, you know, and as a handout. I mean, it's, you know, still good to have both. So
Yeah, can you publish it, Abby, through USGS? Like make it a USGS publication?
Maybe. There's probably too many acronyms on it. I don't know. Yeah, I haven't thought through that part of it yet. So. Aha, we can publish it in the ESIP Figshare repository. So we have a landing place. Sorry.
Yeah, there's been a whole bunch of good suggestions coming in the chat as well, Abby. So.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I had some closing comments. So yeah, thank you immensely, everyone, for your feedback and suggestions. We really value your input a lot, so we appreciate you coming and thinking this through with us and pointing out the places where we're missing things. So thank you so much. There's only so much we can think of, so we appreciate the brain power that the ESIP community provides. So thank you. We're hoping to finalize the primer soon. So I think that's where me and the co-chairs were thinking about going with this, was to kind of finalize it and relatively soon, and then maybe move on to some new work for the cluster. But we'll be discussing that at the next cluster meeting, which will be August 5th at 1400 Eastern, if you'd like to join us. And there's also the mailing list and the channel in the Slack, so you can join the conversation there if you have more input to provide to us. And then there's also the 5 ways to stay involved in ESIP at the bottom of the document. So yeah, keep in touch. Let's keep working on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Robert.